JJ, the CPA here. Hope you're doing well. Hey, thanks for tuning in. Talking about the utility expenses that are going to count as it relates to the PPP forgiveness application. And we've got to look into two different documents. So I wrote down here where we're going to be looking because you've got the PPP forgiveness application, but then the SBA put out a set of guidelines on May 22nd. Both of these things you can find on my website, jjthecpahelp.com. No booby traps, just there for you for free. You don't have to give me your email or nothing to get a copy of it. But where we're gonna be looking here, I'm gonna bring this a little bit close, if you will, is we're gonna be looking at the actual application on page 2, okay? And we're gonna be looking at item number 2C, and then we're gonna be looking at the application page 3, line 4, and then these SBA guidelines, the ones that have forgiveness. There's lots of SBA guidelines, but the guidelines that have the forgiveness on it, okay? And we're gonna be looking at page 12, number 4, item A. What? A lot of stuff there, okay? So if you look in the body of the email, I've wrote that down there as well, what I'm referencing here. So we're talking about the utilities. We're talking about, now this falls under non-payroll costs, obviously, right? And so remember, with non-payroll costs, there's a max 25% that can be forgiven of the amount that you spent, okay? So interesting on this one, okay? So when you look here, okay, which is on page 2, number 2C, what I want to do is I'm going to read it to you, so story time. And the reason I want to read it to you is so that I'm not giving you my opinion on it. I'm telling you exactly what it says. So on the application, page 2, number 2C, this is so if you don't have it in front of you, it says covered utility payments, okay? Business payments for service for the distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone or internet access for which the service began before February 15th, 2020. So they want you to have already had it into play. That transportation is interesting on that. My understanding is that's going to apply to the self-employed, and it's gas that was used in the vehicle that you're using for business purposes, the gas that was used for business purposes. Interesting on that. So with the utilities, okay, that gives us then the explanation, and then really it's going to go on page 3 of the application for forgiveness, and it's line 4 of page 3 where you're gonna put your total utility payments. You got to pay attention on this PPP application for forgiveness. I wish they would have had just line 1 through 50 or whatever, but it's line 1 through 11 on this one, but then there's a line 1 through whatever on Schedule A, and then a line. So you got to really be mindful when you're looking through the application that when you're looking at a line item and the description for it or the definition of it, you're really looking at the correct form. I'm just telling you, it's going to be easy to look at something and think it's going to this form when really it's applying to this form. Enough said on that, which is to say, you have to go to the, I'll probably be done in like 3 minutes. You have to go to the SBA guidelines. Just my son wants me to go help him with something on the pitching. Gotta do that, but I want to keep going on this video. But anyways, if you go now to the SBA guidelines, go to the forgiveness one. So when you go to the SBA guidelines, in the first page, it'll say kind of what it's regarding, and this says forgiveness. We're going to page 12, 4A, okay? So on this, it's talking about the non-payroll costs, right? So even though I'm talking utilities, it's also talking about non-payroll costs in number 4A. And it says, when must non-payroll costs be incurred and or paid to be eligible for forgiveness? That's a question that's been put into here. It says, a non-payroll cost is eligible for forgiveness if it was paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing date, even if the billing date is after the covered period. So I'm sure there's somebody that already left the video and like, oh man, he's just reading to us. Well, I'm reading to you because this is some pretty exact language. This is pretty studious, okay? I'm trying my best to entertain you, okay? But this is just calculation stuff. So I am reading that verbatim so that there's no confusion, and I'm telling you where to go read it yourself, but so you don't have it in front of you, I'm reading it to you. So enough said on that. But there's an example in here that you're not gonna believe, because I read it and I read it twice. I was like, what? So in this example, okay, this is an example from here, okay? This is not my own example. This example is from the SBA, okay? You're gonna go to the SBA guidelines, page 12, 4A, and you're gonna find this example. So check this out. The covered period, okay? So this covered period is the 8 weeks, and the covered period is June 1, okay, through 7/26, okay? So this is the 8 weeks. This is the 56 days of the covered period. Now, we're talking about non-payroll costs. So if you're looking at payroll, you can do an alternative payroll date, but you don't have that opportunity when it comes to utilities or non-payroll costs. It has to be during the covered period. There's no alternative period, which is kind of weird though, because they're saying, well, you can pay it after the covered date if it includes dates that were in the covered date. What are we talking about here? So on the utilities, what they literally indicate is that if somebody were to pay the May utilities and the June utilities, okay, that's going to count, okay? 2 months of utilities counts. Now let's be clear here. The covered period date was June 1, okay? These would have been utilities that were incurred in May, paid in June. This is through 7/26, so the utilities make sense to me that are incurred in June, they're paid in July. Okay, makes a lot of sense. So these are both included because they were paid, okay? They were paid during the covered period, which is why that's why I read to you verbatim what it says on page 12 there as it relates to the utilities, okay? But check this out. It says, this isn't me, okay? This is in the example from the SBA guidelines. But they're saying that if it, in August, okay, they pay the utilities, so just bear with me, okay? You can tell this isn't what I do for a living. Yet. Boy, that just landed straight on my foot and it hurts like an SOB. So we're just gonna let the show go on. All right, utilities. In August, they pay the utilities. So the amount from 7/1 to 7/26 is included. I'll move away from this a second so you can see what I'm writing. Damn, that hurt. All right, good thing you're not paying for this video, okay? That's just free. Covered. So even though, I mean, it literally says in here that in August they pay the utilities, okay? If you're paying anything in August that is after the covered period, but because there's utilities that were incurred during the covered period, even if it is paid for after the covered period, it can be included. Interesting. What? literally from the example. So here's the deal. Someone got May and June, okay? Right, May and June, because it was paid in the covered period, okay, gets to be included in line 4. What's page 3, line 4? It's the line where you put your total utility payments, okay? But then, even though the utilities were paid after the covered period, they're paid in August, they can include the utilities from 7/1 to 7/26. So whatever was included in that for that period, they get to include. And so how would you do that? Well, it doesn't go that far, but I would assume, right, you take that utility bill for the month, divide it by 31, or however many days. Maybe it's not perfectly the month, but however many days that utility bill covered, divide it by that number of days, multiplied by the days that are in there. So you should be able to figure that out. Only thing I'm going to put up here is what's from the SBA guidelines, okay? You'll be able to figure this part out. You'll come up with a methodology. It's not hard. So really what's interesting here is that we have a situation where someone is getting to include more than 2 months of an expense for non-payroll costs, which is here on the utilities. Now, here's what I wish, okay? So it's talking about non-payroll costs here, and they use the example of the utilities, okay? And then in that same number 4, they talked about mortgage interest and you can't prepay it. But if you were to go back to, page 3, okay, of the forgiveness application, page 3, line 4, which is the business utility payments. I'm wondering, okay, there's a line item, number 3, okay, which is for rent. Line 3 on page 3 of the app is for rent. Line 4 is for utilities. I don't want this arrow to confuse anybody. So line 4 is for the utilities. Now, I want you to keep in mind this. If you're like, man, that is a freaking mess up there. I didn't write these guidelines. I didn't put it on 3 different pages and in the guidelines, okay? This is a mess because of how it's been presented to us. But line 3 is for the rent. Line 3 is non-payroll costs. So I don't know. Can this work the same as for the rent? You know, so if somebody was behind in rent, right? And so in this covered period, they had to pay the prior period, the next period, but then they fall in the same circumstances. You know, are we able to apply that same thing to rent? The short answer is I don't know. But when you look here and you're looking at number 2 on page 2 of the loan forgiveness application, okay? You're looking at page 2, number 2, but then look at number B or letter B. It says covered rent obligation, business rent or lease payments pursuant to a lease agreement for real or personal property in force before February 15th, business rent or lease payments. But it says covered rent obligations. So I'm not trying to find a way, but I'm just saying it's saying covered rent obligations. So, I mean, until there's further verification, it seems like if you were in this period and you had to pay May's rent because you didn't have the money till you got the PPP. So you're in June paying May's rent, right? That usually doesn't happen that way. When you hit June 1, you're usually paying June rent, right? But if in June you're paying May's rent, and then in July you're paying July's rent, and maybe in June you're paying June's rent, right? Would you be able to include 3 months of rent? Well, here's the deal. It would work exactly the same way. Meaning, May is in the past. but it was paid in the covered period. So it appears you'd be able to include that even for the rent. I would assume June would be paid during that covered period. But we know that you're not paying rent after the fact. So here on 7/1, there would be rent paid, which would be 3 months of rent because it's paid and incurred. See, this is why I'm glad you stuck with me, because now you know why I literally wanted to read what was in the guidelines and not just tell you. Okay? I wanted to read it because I want you to go back. On the rent, you're going to probably have to draw your own conclusion. Okay? For me, I don't have rent. Okay? If I was doing this for a client based on what I know right now, based on the fact that they gave that example for utilities, okay, I probably would be applying it to rent because it says rent obligations paid and incurred. So if you paid in this period, even if it was back rent, it seems to be included. I want you to remember, this came out May 22nd. So up until May 22nd, I was saying, you know what? It's just going to be 2 months of rent. It's just going to be 2 months of rent, okay? This example here is blowing my mind because clearly it's including more than 8 weeks of utilities, which seems that it can include more than 8 weeks of rent. But here's what the Treasury and the Secretary, or Secretary of Treasury and the Administrator, whatever. Here's what the U.S. Treasury and the SBA are saying. This close up right here is that, remember, your utilities and the rent and the interest, it can't be more than 25% of the loan that counts. So in some ways, I think they're like, well, no one can go too hog wild on this thing because not more than 25% of the loan can be allocated to non-payroll costs. But they literally say that in the guidelines. I mean, literally they are saying that. So this is not opinion as it relates to the utilities. Might be on the edge of an opinion as it relates to rent. And the only reason I'm saying that is that we didn't have an on-point example. But when you match these things together and you go, well, they talked about utilities, and on page 12, item 4A, it didn't say rent and utilities. It just said non-payroll costs, okay? And then it gave an example on the utilities, okay? So non-payroll costs includes utilities and rent. So on page 12 in B, on 4B, it talks about the mortgage interest or the loan interest and how it can't be prepaid. Okay? So if they didn't mean for rent to be included, they would have said, hey, on rent, it's only for 2 months, or rent, it's only rent for 56 days, or rent's only 8 weeks. And I'm not trying to find a way to scam the system. I'm just saying, I'm actually quite surprised. And I know Tony, our friend Tony down in Florida, was like, what is this incurred and paid, like when the loan application first came out on May 15th. So May 22nd here, days ago, we get the guidelines to go along with the application here. And in the guidelines, number 4 on page 12 is addressing non-payroll costs. And in 4A, they address it as it relates to the utilities, okay? So on 4A, they'd say a non-payroll cost is eligible for forgiveness if it was paid during the covered period or incurred during the covered period and paid on or before the next regular billing date, even if the billing date is after the covered period. So in 4A, it's covering non-payroll costs, and what it's defining there is eligible for forgiveness, paid during or incurred during, even if paid after the covered period. And then it just gives us an example. So there's nothing on point related to the rent other than we can absolutely, in my mind, conclude. You're going to have to conclude this one on your own. But I really feel like I can conclude that line 3 on page 3 of the application can be treated the same as utilities. So this example right here came from the SBA. They are the ones that came up with this, not me. They literally said, here's the covered period. If you pay May and June during the covered period, it counts. And then they indicated that if you paid utilities in August, but it covered the, it included part of the covered period, that even if it was paid in August, it's includable. So on this, let's be clear, on rent, you couldn't somehow include August rent in here, okay? But if you're behind on rent, so you're paying May rent and June rent, and you're paying July rent, I mean, it's without trying to rig the system, all three would be included. But again, they're like, okay, you know what? We're just going to let it be included. People maybe didn't have the means till they got PPP, but they said they're not worried about it because it's a max 25%. All right, hey, I'm going to be doing a series of these, but holy moly, we're at 21 minutes. Thank you for sticking with me. But that was one line item that turned into 2 line items of an 11-page SBA PPP forgiveness application, okay? So, are the other videos gonna be shorter? I don't know. As you can tell though, I'm trying to give you a full glimpse on making sure that you're including everything that you can properly, okay? This isn't like, whoo-hoo, look at what we can do, okay? Everybody's already got their PPP money by now. Well, I guess there's a few that haven't gotten it yet. But the point is when you get the PPP money, you either had the money to pay these back things or you didn't. And if you're now watching it going, oh, I'm getting ready to get my PPP money and I'm getting ready to pay before, now I'm just gonna hold on to it. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you on that. This isn't a video to tell you how to be all excited and how to maneuver some money around. I'm just telling you, here's what the guidelines say. Here's what the PPP application says. Here's the breakdown. Here's the examples. And then I'm telling you on the rent what my opinion is. But my opinion, I feel, is based on everything I just told you. And I think on the rent, you can include the 3 months. You're just going to have to make a decision on your own, only because they're not on point. All right, hey, thanks for tuning in. We got more coming on the whiteboard, so I'm excited about that. Boy, I should have asked everybody before now, but I'd love it if you'd subscribe. And then don't you forget, you've never met a CPA quite like me.